Okay, shall we start? I think we have 35 people right now. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another webinar for the Salt Basins TIG. Today we have Dr. Evey Gannaway. She's an assistant professor at the University of Utah with the College of Geosciences, College of Science. And she has originally from Memphis, Tennessee. She received her BSc in geology from SWANY, the University of South, and followed that up with a year spent in Germany as a Fulbright scholar at Technical University of Munich. She received her MS and PhD in geological sciences from the University of Texas, El Paso, working in salt sediment interaction research consortium, and which is led by Dr. Kate Giles and Mark Rowan. Her work in salt tectonics focused on the interplay between salt structures and adjacent depositional and deformational systems. She was a visiting assistant professor at New Mexico State University before taking her current position in 2020 as assistant professor in the Department of Geosciences at Utah State University, based at Eastern campus in Price, Utah. She'll be talking about interplay, the nature of Aulet and Adons Diapirs in Spanish Pyrenees. And welcome, Dr. Evey. And you could share your screen.
Is that?
Yeah, you need to, yeah, good.
You to see?
You're all set. Yeah, you're all set.
Right, excellent. Well, good morning, afternoon to thank you for the introduction. As I said, my name's Gannaway, assistant professor of geosciences here at Utah State University. And for those of you that are familiar with Utah geology, I sit basically at the sequence stratigraphy look at the book hills, of the book cliffs here in Price, Utah. It's actually not my background today for those that are curious. This is the Sanderfeld Swell and another mecca of geology in this area. So today we're going to go completely away from Utah.
Sorry to interrupt, Evey. Are you, just to double check, are you using the right mic? Because you're coming through a bit robotic sounding. Just make sure you've got the right hardware selected.
Is this any better?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Great. Again, oddities of Zoom. It always seems to be a different microphone that I want to have. And let me, before I get too far, the laser pointer there. Okay, so I'll start again. I apologize. So Evey Gannaway Dalton here. Pronouns are she, her, hers. Should have started with that. And an assistant professor of geosciences at Utah State in Price, Utah, near the Book Cliffs. For those of you that are familiar with that. Today we are going to talk about another geologic mecca, the Pyrenees, and this is some work that comes out of my PhD. So with my collaborators or co-advisors from my PhD, Kate Giles, Josep Anton Munoz, and Mark Rowan, where we were investigating and interpreting the nature of the Aulet and Adons Diapirs in the Spanish Pyrenees that have, as we'll see, some conflicting interpretations from the past, and trying to approach this from a more sedimentologic and stratigraphic perspective to provide some insights. So first, I just want to start with some acknowledgements this morning. First and foremost, a land acknowledgement for the research that I'm presenting here. So USU Eastern sits on the traditional homelands of the Ute Indian tribe. That's where, of course, I am today, but my As was mentioned, my PhD, I earned that from UTEP, which sits on indigenous land from various different borderland tribes of that region. So just in an offering this land acknowledgement, wanting to affirm that indigenous sovereignty history and experiences before we move on. In addition to my collaborators that I mentioned earlier, I also want to acknowledge a few folks from the University of Barcelona for their assistance in the field and guidance outside as well. Fred Escosa, Maria Roma, and Oriol Ferrer, some of whom are likely on this call this morning. And finally, just to acknowledge the funding for this research, principally from the Salt Sediment Interaction Research Consortium that was mentioned earlier, based at UTEP, those present and past sponsors, as well as AAPG, GSA, GCAGS, and others for research grants that supported this, and travel grants to present this research, and also UTEP, the graduate school, for the doctoral dissertation fellowship that allowed me to wrap this work up. So let's dive in just to give you an idea of kind of how this talk will proceed. I'm just going to start with a very, very brief overview of some key concepts that I've used for salt-related growth strata that will be important, and this will allow us to introduce some goals of this project before diving into the meat of the discussion, starting with the geologic setting of the Aulet and Adons Diapirs, the analysis and characterization of the mini basins that flank those diapirs, and how that leads us to interpret spatial and temporal evolution of those diapirs, and wrap up with some conclusions and just kind of give you an idea of where this work is progressing in the future as well. So just to get us started with again, very brief highlight of key concepts with respect to the salt-related growth strata that are really fundamental for the work that I'm going to present today, which of course can be at a range of scales that are represented here on these schematics and seismic images that you see. So we have at the smaller scale our halokinetic sequences, those near diapir, unconformity-bound stratal packages that thin and are upturned within something less than a kilometer of the salt sediment interface. And these are developing and forming in response to drape folding over the edge of a passive salt diapir, where the relative width of that folding depends basically upon the interplay of salt rise versus sediment accumulation. Then if we go to the other end of the spectrum, we can get features known as megaflaps. So these are defined as near vertical to overturned panels of this really deep mini basin strata that can extend far up the flanks of these steep-sided salt diapirs, or of course their equivalent wells. So we can have several kilometers of vertical structural relief, and with the folding upwards of 7 kilometers high, 5 kilometers wide. And we believe these represent the relatively thin roof that would be deposited over some body of inflated salt. And then it's going to be subsequently rotated into these steep orientations by either halokinetic drape folding, shortening related squeezing, or some combination of those processes. So in addition to just kind of those key features, I also want to introduce the crux of the issue here. And that is, as we're going to see, we have two conflicting interpretations of how these Adons, or Aulet and Adons diapirs developed. And the fundamental root of those conflicting issues is that they are based upon different models for how those diapirs or what those salt bodies were. So one thing I also want to point out just before I go into this, and you'll see this here, that I'm going to use this term mini basin with no connotation for a specific salt tectonic origin. So essentially just talking about a tectonostratigraphic domain. I mean, using that term mini basin, again, with no connotation to how that mini basin formed. So we have kind of one starting model where we have passive salt diapirs, and those mini basins develop or due to salt withdrawal. So in other words, where our subsidence is driven primarily by differential loading and evacuation into these rising passive salt diapirs. And so in that case, we would expect strata that thin and upturn towards that diapir margin. In kind of the second panel that you see here, we have these salt bodies as salt rollers, flanked by extensional rollover mini basins. So here our subsidence is driven primarily by gravity-driven extension above salt. And so in this case, we'd expect the strata to thicken into hanging walls of these listric normal faults that you see here. There's, of course, also the possibility of both of these processes playing a role, as you see in this final panel here. Now, I also see some notes in particular about what we might expect in these different models for the, in particular, sedimentologic stratigraphic record. And that is, again, kind of the crux of the project goal here, because as we're going to see, previous interpretations of these two, or of this region have relied principally on structural data, but they've ended up with fundamentally dissimilar results, as we'll see. So essentially, I came into this with what can the sedimentology and stratigraphy tell us? Relying instead on, or better yet, on in tandem, make use of sedimentologic details, stratigraphic architecture, etc., with that structural data to try to shed some light on the evolution, the nature and evolution of these features. And so with that in mind, I've highlighted here kind of what those expectations would be. And the key takeaway is that features like halokinetic sequences, where we would expect facies, sedimentary facies that coarsen towards our diapir, closer, more proximal to our diapir, things like diapir-derived detritus, etc. These are going to be vital for distinguishing between passive salt diapirs that are emergent and shedding material out into the adjacent depositional environment, and our salt rollers that are essentially not. So that sets the stage for us to begin talking about this question. And to do that, we need to head to the Pyrenees. So the Aragonese Catalan Pyrenees, which you see here, this asymmetric upper crustal double wedge that forms the plate boundary between Iberia here to the south and Europe here to the north. And so the Pyrenees, as I'm sure many of you know, developed by late Cretaceous to middle Miocene, so essentially alpine aged collision and inversion of the Pyrenean, the pre-existing Pyrenean rift arm or rift basin that we'll look at here in just a second. But just before we do that, I want to focus on our study area in particular, and that is the Ribagorja Basin that you see right here in the south central Pyrenees. This is about right at the boundary between the axial zone that's shown in this sort of darker blue color and the southern Pyrenees or the South Pyrenean thrust sheets that you see in greens and browns. And if you see this cross section that runs just to the east of our study area, you can see kind of its general location right at that boundary between the axial zone and the South Pyrenean thrust sheets. And we're actually in this uppermost, structurally uppermost Boischel thrust sheet here. And you'll notice these pink bodies at the base, and these are Triassic Kuiper evaporites, which is going to be our salt today that we're going to focus on. And many of these thrust sheets are in fact attached on that, as we'll see. But let's first back out this kind of more recent compressional tectonic event. And here we have the Pyrenean rift system. And so this is going to develop during the breakup of Pangea. So we're going to get multi-phase Triassic to Cretaceous rifting of Pangea, developing these east-west, northwest, southeast basins as basically the Bay of Biscay and the Atlantic Ocean further to the west begin to open, and the Pyrenean rift system is an arm of that extension. And in that Pyrenean rift system, we're going to get deposition of the Triassic Kuiper evaporites, followed by just thinking very generally Jurassic to Lower Cretaceous synrift, and then Upper Cretaceous post-rift sedimentation. And so I just want to kind of point out a few important things is during this during our latest stages of rifting, so this would more specifically be Albian to Middle Cenomanian, the extension in the Pyrenean Rift Basin becomes very localized along this rift axis that you see here in green and blue on this diagram on the right, and very localized to this kind of narrow domain, whereas as we go to the north and to the south, in our case, to the rift margins, the rifting there has actually ceased along those more proximal domains along the rift margins, shown here in light blue. And the Ribagorja Basin is going to sit here along this northern Iberian margin in the south. And so, in other words, our basin is going to deepen off to the north, and beginning, as we're going to see in the synrift and continuing into the post-rift phase, we're going to get gravity-driven, salt-detached, basically extensional collapse. And then this is going to continue into the post-rift, as I said, as basically thermal and loading subsidence is going to continue to enhance that northward tilt of the Pyrenean Rift Basin. All right, so let's focus in on our study area of the Ribagorja Basin. So in the bottom right, I have just a very simple diagram to show you in pink Triassic Kuiper evaporites, these various different bodies and their sort of lateral extents and connections, as you see here. And so we have to the west, the Aulet Diapir, to the east, the Adons Diapir that we're going to be talking about today. And then we have these three tectonostratigraphic domains, or mini basins, as I'll refer to them. The Sopera mini basin here, the San Gervas here, and the Fayada here. Now, we are going to just zoom in on this region, and that is our geologic map that's over here on the left. So again, just to orient you, the Aulet Diapir, the Sopera mini basin, the Adons Diapir, the San Gervas mini basin, and the Fayada mini basin. And then this little inset that I'll talk about here shortly comes from right in here. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start in the west, work our way east and then north. And without giving away too much of the punchline, I'll start to make some preliminary descriptions and interpretations that we'll see again as we go through. So the Sopera mini basin we see to the south of the Aulet Diapir here sits to the south of the Aulet Diapir, excuse me. And we've got a panorama that we have in the bottom right of the subvertical megaflap composed of the Aulet Formation that we'll talk about here at the start. So this panorama, where we're actually located right about here, looking from west to east, and at this subvertical strata that you can see here. Now, as we continue from the Sopera mini basin and move east, we're going to encounter this region known as the Yastari Fault Zone. And so this is, again, this inset that's blown up here, where you could see a series of primary and synthetic faults that's going to bound this really complexly deformed package. And that fault zone, just very generally, is going to separate this Sopera mini basin from the San Gervas as we move to the east. So let's do that. Let's move to the east and juxtapose across that fault zone. In this bright green on the geologic map, this is a completely overturned megaflap. So this is the San Gervas mini basin south of the Adons Diapir. And here again is a nice panorama. Here we're looking from south to north at this Santa Fe formation that again has been completely overturned in this location, forming this megaflap and this nice resistant ridge that we can see here. Now, I understand this is obviously a very complex set of 3D geometries. So I've just thrown together this really simplified sketch to help us visualize these two megaflaps are subvertical to the west and are completely overturned to the east, juxtaposed across this Yastari fault zone in between. So from here, we're now going to move north for a second. And finally, here we have our Fayada mini basin sitting to the northwest of the Adons Diapirs. Fortunately, the geometry and topography don't lend themselves to a beautiful panorama, but I think as you start to focus your eye in here, you can likely already see the upturned strata and this steeply dipping to slightly overturned succession along this flank that, again, without giving away too much punchline, indicates halokinetic sequences along this margin. So with just that framework to go from, let's return to that project goal of interpreting or integrating, I should say, the sedimentology and stratigraphy into the interpretations of the origin of these diapirs and the nature of these mini basins and why that was our goal in the first place. So to do that, I want to show you now the conflicting existing interpretations and just how dramatically different those end up being depending on which model you use, which model you invoke for the evolution and mechanisms of subsidence, excuse me, to develop those. So I've added now 2 purple lines on here that represent part of, but not all the extent of 2 cross sections I'm going to show you on the next slide. And notice that they're generally in the same vicinity, but they do differ in their locations somewhat. So they're going to intersect slightly different stratigraphic successions, but in general run through the same area. So we've got model A in the west and model B in the east. And here we go. So on the left-hand side, we have that model A from the west, and right-hand side, we have model B from the east. So model A invokes subsidence by primarily differential loading and salt evacuation, as the Aulet diapir that you see here on this cross-section evolved as a passive salt diapir. And then you have the flanking Sopera salt withdrawal mini basin to the south. So if we were to very simply back out that Pyrenean contraction, it might look something like these schematics that I showed you earlier and that you see here on the lower left. Now go to the other side of our slide and we see our salt roller interpretation. So here we're invoking subsidence primarily by gravity-driven extension above salt. So Aulet diapir evolving as a salt roller with the flanking Sopera extensional rollover mini basin to the south. And again, if we were able to very simply back out that contraction, we're going to see something that looks something like this in the lower right. So even without going into too many details, you can probably very clearly see we get 2 wildly different subsurface geometries from the same superficial geologic mapping data. There is very limited well data, 1 well that you see marked on both of those. So again, our goal was with this project was to integrate those sedimentologic details, stratigraphic architecture, etc., with the existing structural data to resolve these discrepancies wherever possible. So with that in mind, we need to briefly familiarize ourselves with the stratigraphy of the Ribagorja Basin and the differences we see from mini basin to mini basin. So first, We have 3 columns here for each mini basin. And at the base of all of these columns, we see the same thing. Our pink color, that is the pre-rift Triassic Kuiper evaporates. Above that, we're going to have some early Synrift Jurassic to lower Cretaceous sediments. But today we're actually going to focus on the late Synrift to post-rift section. And that I'm going to highlight here in with these boxes includes the Synrift, so late Albian to Cinnamanian, Aulet, and Sopera formation, and then moving into the post-rift Cinnamanian to early Santonian, Santa Fe, Ardina, and Agua Silence formations. Above that, at the top, you're going to see the basically late Santonian and younger synorogenic sediments associated with the Pyrenean orogeny. So what I really want you to take away from this, from these columns, is just how different each of these stratigraphic columns is. So for instance, we see, very thick Aulet to Sopera package here in the Sopera mini basin. And it's not in either of our other 2 mini basins, but there we have Santa Fe, Pardina, and Agua Silence, as well as in all of our other 3. But notice that they've got wildly different thicknesses. So we're already able to see that there's some really dramatic differences in our sedimentology and our stratigraphy. So we're going to start in the west, where our oldest Synrift strata are preserved. Again, this is our Sopera mini basin to the south of the Aulet Diapirs. So just giving us a focused view of our geologic map here, the Aulet Diapir and the Sopera mini basin here. So here's that same photo pan that I showed you earlier. It's annotated now. So we've got this subvertical megaflap here. I've also highlighted where that ends in the Ustari fault zone, and we actually move into our adjacent San Gervas mini basin. But here we can see this, this is the Sierra de Aulet that is the principal feature on the skyline here. And the Aulet formation, we've subdivided into 3 informal units based on this very distinct outcrop bedding character and then petrographic analysis to follow that up. So we have these thick resistant beds of the lower Aulet, followed by a thin recessive package of the middle Aulet formation that's here at the base of the mountain. You can see it just here as well. And then we have, as we move into the valley floor, these cycles of upper Aulet that we can see here. So fairly obvious differences in outcrop bedding character that also tie to substantial differences in the petrography, especially as we look at lower and middle to upper units. So the lower Aulet formation very broadly comprises mostly upper shore face to foreshore orbitalinid rich skeletal limestones. We've got lesser lower shore face facies in the west and lagoonal facies in the east, but principally this upper shore face to foreshore environment with very rich in orbitalinids, unique Cretaceous foram that you can see in these thin sections here. As we move into the middle Aulet, also very foram rich orbitalinids plus other smaller forams that indicate a lagoonal depositional environment. And then we move into the upper Aulet where we have offshore marine to upper shore face spiculatic limestones in the offshore marine environment, and then up to skeletal limestones in the shore face environment. Really rich in forams, but no orbitalinids. And so essentially what this boils down to is that these are generally deeper environments in our upper Aulet, where orbitalinids are not happy, whereas our lower and middle Aulet represent relatively shallower water environments. So if we take these together, these 3 kind of general facies that I've just described, taken together indicating deposition on a wave-dominated carbonate ramp shore face. So we've got that just shown here. And on the right-hand side, we've also got a fence diagram to look at the variations from east to west. And the first thing I want to point out is that east and west are flipped. So east is on the left, west is on the right. You'll see why here in just a second. So with that in mind, just point that out. And then we can kind of pick out a few general trends. First, we take a look at the lower Aulet. And before I get too far, the darker the blue, the deeper the water on these diagrams, on this fence diagram. So lighter blue, shallower water, and then green is our lagoonal facies. So first, the lower and middle Aulet that you can see here show dominantly this progradational stratal architecture where that carbonate ramp was shallowing through time. And then that is followed by a really dramatic or abrupt deepening of the upper Aulet strata that we see through here, and primarily retrogradational stratal architecture. It's going to continue generally into this overlying Sauper strata as well. So these progradational lower and middle Aulet, and then followed by retrogradational upper Aulet, we have a very distinct transgressive surface that you can see here in green that separates these two. So another important takeaway is the facies distribution, or lack thereof in some cases, of these units from west to east, again, left to right here. So I mentioned lesser occurrence of lower shore face facies here in the west and lagoonal facies here in the east. And these broad lateral facies changes are in tandem with also broad thickness changes. Over this is about 1,400 meters of distance between these sections. Now note that we've got a fault at the base here that does cut out and obscure the base of the lower Aulet. So we only used the section that we could correlate from place to place between all of the sections, but use that to determine that our strata is thinning by over 50% from west to east. So then if we go into our upper Aulet, we see something starkly different. We see very minimal differences in our strata. So they're kind of railroad tracks from west to east. And they're also, they thin much less, so less than 20% thinning from west to east. So we've got these very consistent belts of facies with very minimal thinning in the upper Aulet formation. Now, why on earth did I flip that? Well, that was to match these drone photographs that we used to help our interpretation, given how steep the topography was in part of this area. So these drone photographs are actually taken down plunge. So we're able to look basically up section. So in other words, north is at the bottom, and that way we are looking at stratigraphic younging towards the top, where we have our lower Aulet, middle Aulet just below this green surface, and then upper Aulet, etc. So again, that is why I flipped those fence diagrams, is to match this photograph. And again, here, this is just to kind of help illustrate those same things we were seeing displayed in the fence diagram, that the lower and middle Aulet strata thin and on-lap, and again, shallow from west to east. And so these are sort of two different photographs, but this little A here is the same A that you're seeing right here. So this is just a continuation of this panel to the east. And so they are, all of that thinning and on-lap and shallowing from west to east is towards our lateral basin margin, that Yastari fault zone that I mentioned earlier. In contrast, again, we look at the upper Aulet strata that are basically subparallel with a little kind of uniqueness at that eastern margin. So first off, before I move forward, into that, I forgot to mention kind of implications for what this thinning and onlap and shallowing means for the lower Aulet. Well, that implies that there is some relative topographic high in the vicinity of the present day Yastari fault zone, again, making that our lateral basin margin. Now, if we look at the upper Aulet, again, we see basically subparallel strata that kind of truck right along from west to east until they're going to terminate at the eastern margin in this unique location with a very prominent Z-shaped map view fold that we're going to see here in just a second. So here again, just to orient you on another drone photograph of our upper Aulet strata here that you see come in and curve, folding quite dramatically and terminating at these three monolithic blocks. So substantially deformed and folded, but again, without any noticeable changes in thickness or in facies. So here's another perspective of these three blocks that you see, 1, 2, 3. We've dubbed the Yastari blocks because there's a little abandoned community of Yastaris actually built into these, built into several of these. But facies wise, they most closely match our lower Aulet strata, albeit with more whole fossils, more abundant mud, so things that we use to interpret them as lagoonal environments. So we envision that these were deposited on that topographic high that I was mentioning along this eastern margin, and that then they were redeposited and shed out into this deepening upper Aulet environment, basically as slump blocks and folding the upper Aulet strata in the process. So the overlying younger strata in this location have been studied really extensively over the years, but I do want to mention them here primarily so we can compare to the other mini basins. And so first we have moving up section into the basinal Sopera formation. That's going to continue to record the growth, onlap and healing of that slump fold that I just mentioned. And above that, we get debris flow facies of the Santa Fe formation, Santa Fe breccia, followed by basinal facies of the Pardina and then Agua Silence formation. So taken together, these are basically capturing that transition from Aulet and Sopera synrift to the Santa Fe and younger post-rift strata as that transgression and deepening of the broader Pyrenean rift basin proceeds. So to consider the implications of these data and interpretations on the evolution of the Sopera mini basin and the Aulet Diapir, we're going to start by looking at this dip section that you can see here. So this is shown here in A to A prime. And so here we have this expanded section, basically subvertical at the salt margin, shallowing up section. You heard me mention some facies and thickness changes laterally across the mini basin, but importantly, what you didn't hear me mention ever was diapir-derived detritus. And so for this reason, we infer that there is a buried listric fault here with an associated salt roller to the south of the Sopera mini basin. It's important to note, though, that if you look at the Aulet formation in green here, we are still some distance from that salt margin. So the critical Aulet strata where we might expect to see halokinetic sequences or diapir-derived detritus, if passive diapirism were involved, they're either hidden in the subsurface or they've been eroded after Pyrenean inversion. Unfortunately, this older strata that you see directly at the salt margin, really heavily vegetated, poorly exposed, and difficult to characterize. So in the end, we're not able to conclusively determine how much of the subsidence in the Sopera mini basin was due to gravity-driven extension above salt versus salt withdrawal and passive diapirism. So, here both published interpretations of the Aulet diapir remain geologically feasible. Now, let's switch our perspective and take a look at this strike section. And this is just our geologic map rotated 180 degrees to approximate a strike section because you've got these really steep south dipping strata. So again, matching the perspective of those drone photos where north is at the bottom and stratigraphic younging is up top, or is up, excuse me. And here we can be much more confident in our conclusions as we see lots of evidence for a topographic high along this eastern margin, the thinning and onlapping and shallowing of those lower and middle Aulet strata, the slump blocks and syndepositional folding in the upper Aulet. So previous work has interpreted this Yastari fault zone as representing basically an emergent diapir that was then subsequently welded. However, again, we found no diapir-derived detritus in any of this stratigraphy. We found no remnant Kuiper evaporites along this or in this Yastari fault zone. So rather than an emergent diapir that was welded, we envision this being more likely an elevated salt ridge. You can see the evolution that we envision here, that ridge being underlain by salt, but remaining completely buried, likely bound by a fault along its margin. And you can kind of see following these panels, A, B, C, D, etc., how we envision that evolution taking place. Let's shift east now across the Yastari fault zone to the San Gervas mini basin, sitting to the south of the Adons Diapir. And again, this is an area that's received extensive focus in the past, so I'm just going to highlight a few things here for comparison's sake. Here, just a kind of from a structural perspective, the San Gervas mini basin represents a doubly plunging overturned syncline. So we have this completely overturned megaflap, this sub-horizontal, and then to steeply overturned Santa Fe, Pardina, and Agua Silence strata. I'll just point out in this kind of light green color, mint green color, if you will. This is the Agua Silence formation, and that there is roughly a twofold expansion of this Agua Silence compared to the surrounding area. That's going to indicate, subsidence increase significantly in the coniation, which is the time period of deposition here. Now, this has similarly been interpreted, as you see here, as an extensional rollover mini basin. We don't see any evidence to contradict this interpretation, but again, would be increased subsidence and gravity-driven extension during the time period of deposition of the Agua Silence, based on its significant expansion. Now, looking at in a little bit more detail of the sediments, beginning with the Santa Fe formation that's here at the top of our panel. This is the reef. This is the source of those debris flows into the Sopera formation. So you've got these big rootists and bivalves, etc., and indicating that this San Gervas mini basin was a relative high at this time. And we have this nice well-developed platform margin to basin depositional profile across these two regions. The Pardina and Agua Silence formations basically look the same. They're essentially identical. They're continuous with that Sopera mini basin, but again, remember that the Agua Silence here is really expanded. So in other words, the platform, the entire platform here has been flooded by that post-rift transgression at this point to give us these basinal facies of the Pardina and Agua Silence. Okay, so finally we reach our final area of focus, the Fayada mini basin to the west of or northwest of the Adons Diapir. And so from the map and these few photos that we have here, we can see, again, these subvertical Santa Fe through Agua Silence strata that are folded and upturned adjacent to the salt margin. You can also see, hopefully, at several locations, some noticeable irregularities in this salt margin. You can see one highlighted right here in this photo. So interpreting these as salt cusps along the margin. Also just a good moment to have a look at what the Kuiper evaporites actually look like. Which you can see here in this photo. Nice reds and tans and yellows, etc., of the Kuiper evaporites themselves. So here again, we focused on our sedimentology and stratigraphy of these three formations. So beginning with our Santa Fe, we have bivalves and orbitolinid skeletal limestones. These are middle to inner shelf skeletal limestones. You've got some restriction at the base. That is when we have limestones that are basically entirely dominated by either bivalves or orbitolinids, as you can see in some of these photos here. So this is the prograding platform behind that shelf margin that we just looked at in the Sant Gervas mini basin. So we're behind that platform here. The Pardina formation, these are calcosphere rich, so these little bubbles, circles that you see here, calcosphere rich limestones that we interpret as basinal calciturbidites. If we move into the Agua Silence formation here, these are sort of quartz and skeletal limestones deposited as slightly shallower basinal calciturbidites, so such that they were modified by storm waves and burrowing. Both of these, again, representing flooding of that carbonate platform as our Pyrenean Rift Basin deepens in the post-rift succession. So we can see an interpretation of the Santa Fe and Pardina Agua Silence depositional systems here. So Santa Fe on the left and Pardina Agua Silence on the right. And here we really want to consider how this compares to our other mini basins, recognizing this middle and inner shelf Santa Fe and slope calciturbidite Pardina and Agua Silence, and also where we are with respect to those other mini basins, and that we are further to the north. And remember that is more basinward in the case of the Pyrenean Rift Basin. So we recognize more landward or proximal facies in this mini basin, despite occupying a more basinward or distal location in the Pyrenean Rift Basin. Another key piece of data here is the occurrence of these dipyramidal or doubly terminated quartz grains that you can see in these lower images here. These are locally known as Jacintas de Compostela. These are derived from the Kuiper evaporites. So in other words, these are Diapir-derived detritus out of the Kuiper evaporites. So again, here we've rotated the geologic map of these steeply dipping Fayada mini basin strata to approximate a strike section. Good time to point out again that we have another significantly expanded section. This time it's our Santa Fe formation, about 1,000 meters thick here versus only 200 in the Sopera and Sant Gervas mini basins. Some of that we can account for sort of time equivalence between the uppermost Sopera and lowermost Sant Gervas, or excuse me, Santa Fe. But we're still left with, roughly 3 times as much thickness here. So how do we explain that? Well, let's return to the map and this approximate strike section that I've got here to remind ourselves of these stratal geometries that show folding and convergence towards the salt margin. You also saw in the previous slide the shallower than expected facies and the dipyramidal quartz, the Diapir-derived detritus. So in other words, we're looking at halokinetic sequences, Diapir-derived detritus, all things giving us strong evidence for passive diapirism of the Adons diapir. So for this reason, we invoke increased local accommodation here in response to salt evacuation from beneath the Fayada mini basin. You can see this schematically being represented here. And so we would have had local subsidence, increased accommodation as the salt evacuated into or moved into our rising passive Adons diapir. And although I'm not going to go into the sequence stratigraphic perspective in detail, What's really cool about this, I think, is that we believe this amplified accommodation actually allows us to preserve a more continuous sequence stratigraphic record than we get in the more regional sections, which is a cool little added bonus, I guess. So with all of these new data and the existing literature, we integrated these to generate schematic depositional facies maps and interpret this late Albian to early Santonian evolution adjacent to these diapirs. So here's just a very schematic basin framework with our Aulet diapir, Adons diapir, the 3 mini basins that you see here, and trying to look at this within a spatial and temporal salt tectonic framework. And a key takeaway is going to be that each mini basin has a unique history with its distinct stratal thicknesses, facies, patterns, and subsidence that are going to be due to the complex interplay of salt tectonics and Pyrenean rifting. So let's step through each of these as we wrap up today. So first we see here in the Sopera mini basin, the lower and middle Aulet formation carbonate ramp shore face being restricted to that deeply subsiding Sopera mini basin. It's going to thin and shallow and onlap towards this uplifted Yastari margin over here. We have ongoing subsidence in only this mini basin. We get deepening of that upper Aulet formation. And now we're going to get slumping off this lateral Yastari margin. But remember, note that these other mini basins remain elevated with erosion or non-deposition in those areas. It's not until we move into the Sopera formation, the basinal Sopera formation, where we get the growth, continued growth and onlap and healing of that slump fold in the Sopera mini basin. And then those depot centers are going to begin to expand into our region. The early Santa Fe platform is going to begin to develop, and as we move into the middle to late Cinnamanian, that post-rift transgression, we're going to get complete kind of broadening of those depot centers into all of our mini basins, with, remember, some influence of salt movement beginning in the Fiata mini basin that we see here. Finally, we have our last 2 panels, the flooding of the platform here in the late Cinnamanian, beginning with our deepest water Pardina in the Sopera mini basin. That's going to thin into the San Gervas, but remember, it's going to shallow but get thicker in the Fiata mini basin. So similar to what we just saw in the Santa Fe. This continues into the Coniation and early Santonian, with the expansion of the Agua Silence here, suggesting that this mini basin really takes off at this point, the San Gervas mini basin, I should say. And at this point, we expect to find shallower water facies above all of these active salt structures. So let me just wrap up with returning to that ultimate project goal and revisiting the conflicting interpretations and what clarity this work can provide. So here's just again a summary of what we just saw, of seeing the subsidence localized beginning in the Sopera mini basin, earliest in the late Albian. As we see in this first panel. The second panel shows us the substance of the Fiata mini basin beginning later in the Cinnamanian, and we've got evidence for passive salt movement of the Adons diapir and increased accommodation as a result. And then also during this time period and also into our final set of panels here, we get subsidence of our San Gervas mini basin, also beginning later, but again, remember, increasing significantly here at the very end of this succession. So first, I hope this work has emphasized the necessity for using both halokinetic sequences and diapir-derived detritus to make compelling arguments for and against passive diapirism. So in the case of the Yastari fault zone, we had neither of those, leading us to interpret, rather than a welded emergent salt diapir, we have instead a buried salt ridge as our topographic high. But the presence of both telling us in the Fiata mini basin that likely that it evolved as a salt withdrawal mini basin, although it may have initiated by extension, just like we expect our others to. What is perhaps significantly less satisfactory is the relationships of the Sopera and Sant Gervas mini basins. They remain a bit more enigmatic, and present exposures really limit what can be said and render these interpretations a bit more inconclusive. The existing interpretations both still being essentially geologically feasible. So with all of that being said, I just want to mention how this work is progressing, and that, basically the idea being that we could now use these sedimentologic and stratigraphic constraints to inform the structural interpretations as we continue to look at the impact of these pre-existing structures in this region, what impact they had on subsequent Pyrenean inversion. So I just say stay tuned for that work in the future. And with that, I'll just say thank you for your presence and open the floor for questions. And I should have probably started with this. If anybody wants a copy of the paper that this is all based on, please give me a shout. I'm happy to provide.
Lovely stuff, Evey. That was very cool. Yeah, the Spanish Pyrenees are pretty great, aren't they?
Absolutely. No shortage of questions to be asked.
Great. If people want to stick their questions in the Q&A, that would be great. I guess a quick question for me with regards to the sort of open-ended interpretation for the, I can't remember the exact name, the Sopera?
Yeah.
Mini basin. Which, on the basis of evidence, which one do you prefer? Or do you not want
in all
to?
honesty, I'm sorry, finish that. I jumped.
No, I just said, like, do you lean towards one, or are you just waiting for more data, or?
Yeah. I tend to actually not for it to be a cop-out, but I actually think that this is a place where the invoking both is warranted, given that we see the very broad facies and thickness changes within the mini basin. But the fact that we know in an adjacent mini basin we have some salt movement, and we can see it other places within the Pyrenees, for instance at the Côtier region, not too far from this, that there is evidence for passive diapirism there as well. So I think likely initiated by evacuation and then kind of taking off. So it would be probably, I would lean towards that C. Again, not to be a cop-out, but I think there's likely a little bit of both in my mind. But that's where we're kind of heading to continue to sort of iterate on this question and see what makes the most sense given the data. Absolutely.
Sounds good. We've got a few comments coming in from the chat. Tunis Hain says, well done, fantastic field area. So agrees that the Pyrenees are a great part of the world. Another comment from Jaume Vergas Massip says, thank you, Evey, for your nice and interesting talk about this beautiful region. Regards.
Thank you.
And Gopal says, thanks for sharing your work with the TIG. Great work.
Thank you. Thank you.
So yeah, please keep your comments coming. Any questions for Evey? Stick them in the chat. I guess another question in the interim from me, because I did a little bit of work with Oriol in the University of Barcelona.
Excellent.
I was lucky enough that he took me up one weekend to Cardona to see the old salt mine. Is there much salt mining in this area? Does this have much of an impact on? I guess the lack of data implies potentially not, but what do you reckon?
Yeah, not to my knowledge. The more active, like the Cardona example that you mentioned, and some other the exposures of salt in the batiks or pre-batiks, I think have active mining. But in this area, not that I know of. I'm afraid I might have to defer to local experts on that one.
Excellent. We've got another comment from Carlos, who says, "Thank you for a great presentation."
Thank you.
So it is 3 o'clock. If you're happy to wait another few minutes, we'll see if anybody has any questions.
Absolutely, yeah.
Or if
I've got an hour to kill before I have to teach my intro class. So shoot.
Fantastic. Yeah. So if you have any questions for Evey, please stick them in the chat. Potentially, it was just so well explained that everybody has understood it perfectly.
I would love to think that, but I think it's more like an overwhelming amount of information, and that I think it overwhelms more than perhaps always explains.
Nice one. I guess one comment, some people seem to have had issues with not being able to see the presentation towards the end. The recording seems to be perfectly fine. So if you had a little bit of trouble towards the end of the presentation, the recording will be live on our YouTube channel in the next few days. So if you did have that issue, don't worry, you will get to see the end of Evey's presentation.
I'm sorry to hear that. I apologize if it was something on my end or a.
No, well, it came through perfectly for me. I think potentially just some connectivity issues for some people. So
yeah.
Yeah, if you had that, please just watch the recording, and all Evey's lovely figures will be there.
Thank you, Evey. We enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you.
Very
Thank you for
very well explained.
Thank you for inviting me. This is wonderful. I really appreciate the opportunity to present.
Welcome. Are there any? I guess one more question for me then is with regards to the field. Like, have you any plans to go back and carry out more field work to sort of build on the results so far, or?
That would be lovely. I would really enjoy that. But actually, in my role, I'm a primarily teaching focused position, so I have a very small research component in my role. And so my research these days is principally focused here in kind of southeastern Utah, in the Paradox Basin. More these days, I will jump at any opportunity to go back. For sure, with the AAPG ice coming up in Madrid, maybe swing something along those lines. That would, I'm never going to say no to that. It was quite a remarkable location to get to spend my field work, for sure.
Yeah, and I guess you're not wanting for good geology with the paradox and all of Utah around you there.
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. I apologize.
Yeah, and Valent has one follow-up question where they ask, are there any big gypsum deposits nearby?
Not to my knowledge, no. I think most of the, at least in the exposures of the Kuiper evaporites here, we get a lot of the shales, the interbedded clastic, and in some cases even there's some igneous material that is also there, but I think again for those kind of well exposed gypsum and other evaporite deposits, you're going to head further south, I think.
That's
At
right.
least not specifically in this area, I'll say.
Great. We've got a question from Jean-Christophe. Beautiful field images regarding the direction of extension and subsequent compression, roughly north-south. Are most of the synhalokinetic features perhaps obliterated? And how would that influence your choice of model?
Well, yeah, I think, if you think about, and actually I can kind of perhaps just show this to help. The one place where we do have good evidence for or against passive diapirism are along these, rather than the north-south features, but along our, or excuse me, rather than along our east-west features, they're along our north-south features. And so I think that that's that perhaps is a useful thing to keep in mind as we are starting to kind of peel these layers back of the compressional event and the pre-existing extensional event, how much of a chance really is there to preserve a halokinetic features along this if that margin is then going to be upturned or rotated, excuse me, during the compression, and then either lost by erosion if it's elevated, or it's sitting in our subsurface. And so where we do have good indicators, you notice that are orthogonal to that, and that's, I think, definitely something to be mindful of when making these interpretations.
Excellent. It looks like Antonio Tichel has jumped in and regarding the gypsum question.
Yeah. Oh, great. Excellent.
It's the shale that is green, not the gypsum, supposedly. So thanks for clarifying, Antonio. And then finally, a question from Giorgio Minelli asks: Is there any anhydrite in the area?
Ooh. You can tell that my focus, I'm afraid, was not so much on the sedimentology of the Kuiper evaporates, and I'm feeling very inadequate to answer all of these questions, and I want to apologize for that. I mean, I know in the Kuiper evaporites, you do have anhydrite, whether that's subsurface or exposed. That I'm afraid I off the top of my head I don't know.
Yeah, no worries. I'm sure there's if people are willing to dig, I'm sure there's plenty of information from the Spanish Geological Survey or local other publications that should be able to talk about the mineralogy of the salt in a bit more detail.
Yes, yeah. But aside from the doubly terminated quartz, which kind of sticks around much longer than those anhydrites and gypsums and etc. As it's shed from the diapir. Beyond that material, I'm afraid I didn't focus as much on the other Kuiper facies.
Yeah, well, from my experience anyway, the Kuiper is usually kind of a mishmash of everything. So there's probably some anhydrite there at the very least.
Yeah. I think that's mismatch is a good word to describe it.
Particularly when it's been churned up so much.
Right.
Cool. Okay, I guess that's all from the questions. So I guess all I'll say is thanks again, Evey, for a great presentation. That was
Absolutely.
very
Thank you.
I guess yeah, if you want to stick up the final slide for people to
Yep.
to chase the paper and get in touch if they have any further questions.
Yeah, please, please. I'm happy to provide the PDF. If you've got a paywall or something like that, or if you've got questions, please reach out. Happy to continue this discourse offline as well.
Excellent. Just a note for everybody in the chat, there won't be a webinar in 2 weeks' time because we have EGU and we expect most people to be attending EGU in Vienna. Are you going, Evey?
I am not. That's still within my semester, so I'm afraid I'll probably be ramping up for exam time.
Excellent. Well, very best of luck with that.
Yeah. Well, I'm not the one that needs the luck there. I think it's the students.
True. We've all been there.
Yep.
Cool. All righty. Well, with that, I'll let you go.
All right.
Thanks again. Thanks for everybody for attending, and we'll see you in 4 weeks' time for our next webinar.
Excellent. Thanks again, Connor.
Thanks, Amy. Bye.
Thanks, Alice.
Bye.
Take care.